I want to introduce Professor Russ Altman from Stanford University. He is probably in many departments, but I know him most in the Department of Bioengineering, and he's done tons and tons of amazing things and a lot on looking at drug action across scales. And I'll just hand it over to you.
Great, thanks.
Russ.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. We're doing a lot of stuff on the technical side, looking at pockets and binding, and I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about a crazy thing that we're also doing, which is large language model to support regulatory submission evaluation by regulators, like at the FDA. So I think we all know, or you won't be surprised to learn, that many of the submissions that are now coming in to the FDA are partially written by large language models, right? I mean, people are using them. It's totally allowed as long as some human takes responsibility for the text that's generated, and it can actually be a productivity improvement. I'm involved in a FDA-supported Center of Excellence, and we got a request from the FDA about building a large language model, not to make decisions, but to be kind of a co-pilot for regulators as they look at new submissions. And so this is pretty exciting. It does raise the possibility that AI will be writing the submissions and that AI will be evaluating the submissions. Welcome to the new world. I hope the AI doesn't kill too many humans. So I just want to tell you about that project, which is really very much in progress. And I'm not going to blow you away with a system that's ready for real-time use, but I want to tell you kind of how it's working. And this is work of a great PhD student in my lab, Betty Zhang, working with computer scientists at Stanford and with some collaborators at the FDA. So the specific use case we're building for is with the Office of Generic Drugs, where we're looking at new generic drug applications where, it's a typical case is the original drug has gone off patent, a new company wants to sell a copy, and they need to prove that it's equivalent. So this is a very focused case, but we're very aware that if we can do this, we might be able to generalize to supporting other regulatory decisions. So of course you want the PK, the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics and the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion to be equivalent, so you can make a decision on whether this new drug will be approved. And they see an opportunity, and we see an opportunity to build a chatbot as a co-pilot, as I said before, for reviewers at the Office of Generic Drugs. Just answering questions. These applications can be hundreds of pages, and you might want to say, did they study, impact on pregnancy? Probably they didn't in this case, unless it was an issue in the original drug. But there's a lot of questions you can ask. And there's a lot of interesting requirements. We cannot train this on proprietary data because they're not allowed to give us proprietary data. So we have to find proxies for drug discussions. For example, journal articles about this kind of evaluation and existing drug labels, which is a big one, which I'll get to. Eventually, if we do have a model that's useful, it should probably be open with available weights, and so ChatGPT is not going to work. ChatGPT is also not going to work because they can't send regulatory submissions from a company over the internet to a third party. That's not allowed. And the FDA doesn't have 10 or 20,000 GPUs, so we have to build a small model that they would be able to use. So this is very much a prototype project to see how can you deal with all these constraints and can you build something useful. So the main idea of this project is to do something that others have done. This is not our idea. And it's called a distilled model. And the idea is that you use a large and capable teacher model, such as GPT-4o, which is from OpenAI, to distill knowledge about how to read a drug application into a smaller, much smaller, student language model that only can talk about drugs, drug labels, and drug features. It can't answer questions about the history of the world. It doesn't know who won the Super Bowl. It has no idea about many things, but it's pretty good at drugs because you have queried GPT-4o thousands and thousands of times and used those question-answer pairs to fine-tune a public domain, much smaller model. So Llama 3.1 with 8 billion parameters. Believe it or not, 8 billion is a very small model. So that's going to be our starting model. That's a baseline. And we're going to try to see how good can we get it at understanding the contents of drug labels. So it turns out that the review process is well represented. The kind of language that you see in applications is very well represented in the kind of language that winds up in drug labels. And that shouldn't be a surprise because those drug labels are literally sometimes written by the folks who submitted the data in the first place. And these are all publicly available, 2,000 or so or more drug labels. And so you can see the little picture at the bottom right where we have a big model like ChatGPT. By the way, I'll show you, ChatGPT is pretty good at reading a drug label and answering questions about it. Then we do this knowledge transfer into a smaller model. And that's what we're trying to do. So we've done some stuff, and I want to tell you about what we've done. So the first thing is these labels are PDFs. I don't want to bore you, but we have to take the PDF and turn it into text. We do that. It's called a markdown. And then we need to figure out how are we going to ask questions of these labels. So that's just a picture of, by the way, I love this picture because one of the big things in a label is the black box warning. Well, guess what? A lot of times when you mark it down to ASCII text, you lose the black box. And so you have to figure out a way to recover big important warnings that would have been in a black box in the PDF that are not in a black box with text because it's not always labeled as such. So we're dealing with things like that. Not very exciting, but critical to get things right. We also know that there are about 9 or 10 things that are very important to extract accurately from a label and also from a drug application. And those would be the indication, if there is a boxed warning, that's why we care about that last slide, bioavailability, food effects, Tmax, metabolism, excretion, half-life, maximum daily dose. There's a lot of other things, but these are very typical questions that you will ask, especially for a generic drug. So we call these our atomic queries, but they're not enough. First of all, I'll show you how well ChatGPT does at answering these questions. But also, even if we could build a model that's great at that, there's a lot of other questions that the reviewers want to ask of a pile of data and text, and a lot of questions you could ask of a drug label. And so we've come up with some clever ways to do that, which I'll show you. And right now, which is we are using the ability of ChatGPT to look at a document. We give it sample questions from that document. The document is the drug label. So we give it a drug label. We give it 9 or 10 questions about indication, boxed warning, bioavailability. And then we tell it, generate a bunch of queries of this label similar to the ones we just showed you based on the contents. And this is called self-instruction because it's going to generate these queries, and then we're going to ask it to answer the query. And just to give you the bottom line, and then we're going to ask it to grade its answer. And believe it or not, it's quite good at all three of those. So for the first one, here is these are all questions created by ChatGPT based on looking at drug labels. We have labeled, the thing to the left of the colon is our label of what kind of question it is. So that first one, we said, this is a question about adverse reactions. But after the colon, that is all from ChatGPT. What are the adverse reactions of the drug? What other drugs interact with this drug? What are the contraindications? Very credible questions that you might ask of a drug label. So we created a gold standard, a very small gold standard of 100 questions and 100 answers that my student, Betty, created answers for. Then she asked those questions to ChatGPT, and she compared its answers to her gold standard answers. Then she asked ChatGPT to use a similar rubric to compare her answers with its own answers. And this is where I have to remind you that ChatGPT is not a human, and it has no pride in its answers. And many of you may have experienced this, but it will give you an answer, and you can say, do you think that's a good answer? And it'll say, no, that's not a good answer. And so we took advantage of that to say, here's the question you came up with. Here's the answer you came up with. Is this a good question? And that's the rubric. Correct. The output matches what Betty did exactly, and it learned what correct is, and now it can do correct for things that Betty didn't do. Extra, which means it contained the answer, but it was too wordy and it contained a lot of extra things that we don't need. Incomplete, which is kind of the opposite. It was partially correct, or just incorrect. It doesn't match. This would be a hallucination, or just it gets the answer wrong because it focuses on the wrong part of the document. So the one result we do have now is how GPT-4 performs at this question, answer, and evaluation. So the green are correct. Betty thinks they're correct. ChatGPT thinks they're correct, and they are correct. And you can see for excretion, method of excretion, like, renal, liver, GI. Food effects, pretty good. Half-life, very good. And that's, let's be honest, that's because it typically says the half-life of this drug in a human with normal kidneys and livers is this. And it just nails that. Indication it's pretty good at. By the way, I should say that red is incorrect, and then it's partial credit for the reds and the oranges, but I'm focusing on the greens. So you can see on the right side of this graph, ChatGPT is pretty good, and therefore if we generate tens of thousands of examples of these, we have some expectation, although we have not proven it yet, that our distilled model will also be good. The problem is over on the left. Maximum daily dose requires math, and ChatGPT is not good at math, so we're figuring out what to do about that. We were a boxed warning. I told you, we lose the box, and so we get it wrong. So we're working on that. And we're working on, and when I say working, it means we're writing bespoke prompts to the LLM to help it get a better answer. And then bioavailability was actually surprisingly not very good. And so those are the ones we're working on before we let it loose. And so I just wanted to show you this because ChatGPT out of the box is pretty good, but it needs some help, especially on those three ones on the left. Once we get those in good shape, I can now tell you my next steps and I can be quiet. We're going to refine our performance on those three ones, which, as I just said, we're going to write some bespoke queries. We're going to scale to thousands of drug labels to get tens of thousands of queries, answers, and evaluations. It turns out that even when it does poorly, that can be useful in training. It's actually related to Pat's talk, right? Negative examples where you say, hey, by the way, this is a bad answer. That's useful for training the LLM. So we're going to give all of that to the model. We're going to, as I said, fine-tune Llama 3.1, which will modify the weights. We will give it the documents, the labels, the questions, the answers, and the kind of confidence in the answers. And then we'll do the real, this is where the rubber will hit the road. For a subset of a couple of hundred of these, we will get, through our collaboration with the FDA reviewers to actually grade the results on new labels that haven't been seen before to see how good it is. At that point, we will probably deliver it to FDA internally for them to not expose it to drug labels, but to expose it to regulatory submissions, and they will tell us how we did, and then they'll tell us what we have to fix in an iterated version. So no time soon will your drugs be approved or not approved by an LLM, but very exciting to be working with our colleagues in regulatory science to see how we might be able to help that process be a little bit more efficient and perhaps taking the best of the reviewers' human capabilities and the best of the LLM's capabilities. So let me stop there and thank the Office of Generic Drugs for their collaboration, and Betty and my colleagues in computer science, Percy Liang and David Hall. And I think we'll have questions later. Thanks.